So good morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are. I'm Hannah Zevan. I'm the founding editor of Parapraxis Magazine and the co-director with Alex Colston, who's up here too, of the Psychosocial Foundation. And this seminar on possibilities of repair is hosted by these two new-ish groups, Parapraxis, a popular magazine of psychoanalysis on the left, and the Psychosocial Foundation, which has just entered its second year. I just want to briefly encourage you, if you're new to us, to sign up on our website for our mailing list. We really seldom spam, but it will be a way of learning about future events. You can check out Parapraxis, which is free to read on the web, but also available for subscription here. And if you loved the Klein or are curious about the Klein or even hated the Klein, we've just started a short course that will begin in March on Klein, taught by Dr. Lynn Zevan, and that's available for sign up here. And scholarship seats are available as well. You can email us. And just to come back for our next keyword session on love in March. And so with all of that out of the way, we are so honored and delighted to start this seminar too on possibilities of repair. It's coordinated by a number of Parapraxis editors, Noor, Zoe, Patricia, Alex, and myself, I think all of whom are here today. And so we're your coordinators and your team. Possibilities of repair is also the topic of Parapraxis' second issue, which is underway. And this seminar will run for 20 weeks, meeting 10 times, starting with today, thinking about questions and possibilities of repair in a world that is clearly in irrepair. And we will start, and for those of you returning from seminar 1, this will be familiar with the classic psychoanalytic texts and approaches to this question and possibility of repair and irreparability, before moving into decolonial and Afro-pessimist approaches to the same question, and then enter into a third section on reparations itself, which at the very end will return us to psychoanalytic approaches to repair with Ferenczi in the final week. Just a word on the seminar. You should have received a welcome email from me with all of the readings in a Google Drive. We will meet at the same link every week, this one. Please do respond to the RSVPs as best you can. We'll pull for attendance 1 week in advance. It will help us get the right number of facilitators on hand for our breakout groups so that they're small enough and not too small. And in the case of clinical conflict in breakout groups, please feel free to rejoin the main Zoom, and I will enter you into a new group where hopefully there will not be such a conflict. Our format for today will be standard across all 10 of our meetings. We'll hear from our presenter today, Fakhry Davids. Cannot wait. In just 1 minute, we'll speak in this instance to Klein, and then we'll all be invited to ask him questions before moving into breakout groups, which will be facilitated. And then we'll return all together to speak about what happened in the small groups, ask further questions if the speaker is still here, and all told running about 2 hours. Throughout, please feel free to make use of the chat, and questions to Fakhry will be moderated. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Fakhry Davids, our speaker for today, who will teach us about Klein and Klein's psychoanalytic usage of the idea of reparation, itself emerging from discourses both in the US and in Europe in the aftermath and in the wake of the plantation and the First World War, the Great War, respectively. So Fakhry Davids, from whom I've learned so much, and I'm so glad to continue learning with and from today, is an honorary consultant psychologist at the London Clinic of Psychoanalysis in the UK. He runs a private practice in psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. He is the author of Internal Racism, a psychoanalytic approach to race and difference, and the editor of also a beautiful volume of essays by Irma Bremen-Pick called Authenticity in the Psychoanalytic Encounter. Fakhry's book is available at this link, and I cannot recommend it enough. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Fakhry Davids.
Well, thank you so much, Hannah, and thank you for asking me to be here. I don't know that I have much to teach you, but I'm very happy to share my appreciation of Klein and what she has to say about reparation. You'll know, of course, that it was Klein who introduced the notion of reparation into psychoanalysis If you look through Freud, there's no mention of reparation and repair. It's a whole different concept. And if Klein were here, she would say to you something like this, that it's entirely an accident that it fell to her to identify that notion. And it's down to the fact that Freud never worked with children. If he had worked with children, Klein would say he would have realized that they are preoccupied with making things better, with repairing things and so on, almost from as soon as they can move, as soon as you can infer anything of, you know, in terms of what their minds might be up to. You can find attempts to make things better, to you know, and that's essentially what the concept of reparation is. So that certainly was her view, that it's something that escaped Freud because of the limitation that he didn't work with children, and that's what it's about. Now, I say that because Klein saw herself as Freud's most loyal follower, and she always believed that whatever she added into the psychoanalytic lexicon came from the fact that she worked with children, observed them, and would have to say, well, this doesn't quite fit with the way Freud described it. You know, and if you look at her early work, she was constantly bending over backwards to try and make it fit with Freud, and very reluctantly added to the lexicon. So that's quite important. And it's important because if you think of her as metapsychologically Freud's daughter, it is true in one fundamental way that really one does have to bear in mind, and that she starts off from the assumption that from the beginning of life, two instincts, the life instinct and the death instinct, operate inside the mind. She doesn't take the view that the death instinct emerges as a response to something else. She says that's the basic equipment we come into this world with. So that's very important. All Klein's thinking is to do with the idea that we have these two basic forces inside of ourselves. That's the first thing. I wanted to remind you, I'm sure you know it from last time, from all your work up to now, but it's important to remember that Klein makes another assumption, and that is that these instincts are real live things that exist in all of us. But we don't feel them, of course, as instincts. An observer such as Freud might look at it and say, I can see this instinct is operating in that person at this stage. But how do we feel it? And Klein, because she had to, if you work with children, you have to study play. They don't free associate in the way adults might. So you have to get involved with play. And then you realize that inside the play is a whole narrative that is living itself out. And Klein thought, well, there must be some sort of fantasy inside the mind which is being played out in the form of the play, which one can then read and relate to and so on. So her notion is that right from the beginning, there is unconscious fantasy that operates in the mind, and it operates in the mind from the beginning all the way through our life until we're done, that we have unconscious fantasy, and they give expression to the, essentially at root, to the life and death instincts. But you see, it's a very, very powerful notion. It means that we experience those things from the beginning. Now, you can't prove that, obviously. That's a postulate, a hypothesis that she makes about infants, as she makes it about you and me. and so on. So unconscious fantasy is very important. And I must emphasize that Klein really means that the fantasy is unconscious. Now that makes a big problem, because if you say something is unconscious, how are you going to show it's there? You've got a real difficulty. And she would say, well, I can only give it conscious kind of meanings. And then, so that's very important, yeah, that there is something or other taking place in the depths of the mind. She thinks it is by way of fantasy, yeah? And that fantasy can be read, and later when we have words, we can put fantasy into words. And if we are sufficiently well trained or observant, then we can also listen to words and receive a different kind of communication of fantasy that doesn't correspond exactly to the words. So I wanted to make that point, that often Klein talks in very graphic terms, but you've sort of got to understand that if she could, she'd say to you, look, I'm terribly sorry about putting this stuff in these terms, but it's the best I can do if I want to convey to you something of how profound, how deep, how powerful the stuff going on in the mind of the infant is. Yeah? So it's sort of important. We've got to cut her a little bit of slack on that count, and understand she's meaning something deep. So unconscious fantasy usually cannot be directly known and can only be known through its derivatives. Yeah, that you'll know is classic Freud. Freud thought the same about instincts. You couldn't know them, you can only know them through derivatives. So if we then think about these two instincts, you'll know, and I'll just go through it again, that Klein would say that an infant is in desperate need for someone or something to recognize its dependency, and particularly how its life depends on somebody else feeding it, clothing it, washing it, holding it tight, all the things that babies need. And she will say in the unconscious, there is some recognition of that, of its neediness. Yeah. And if the infant once has had an experience of somebody in the outside world meeting that neediness, that becomes an instantiation of its life instinct. Yeah? It has reached out to an object, its need has been gratified, and it has some prototype fantasy of a loving relationship. Of course, an infant is a long way from knowing what love is. So when we say a loving relationship, it's for us. It means a certain set of things that we would say, now, if that infant didn't do that, didn't have that, it wouldn't survive. So this is for sure on the side of life. That's where it belongs. And Klein, as you know, also says that in the beginning, that's as much that apprehension of something loving, which she calls simply a good relationship. And she, in order to get us to realize, she doesn't mean the mother from the baby's point of view. We'd say, oh, that's the mother did that. But she says, how would the baby know what a mother is? So when she says it's a relationship to the breast, she's trying to get us into how the baby might picture this thing, what the fantasy might look like. And the important point about that is that that fantasy is idealized. Yeah? That is, it is felt to be supremely good, absolutely marvelous. It is where you want to be. It is being in heaven. It's being in the pound seats and all this sort of thing. That's your first love relationship. Real. You all know, you all remember that from being in love. That's how it feels. Yeah. But from the point of view of us looking at it, we'd say that's idealized because the baby hasn't yet figured out that that same person who's involved in this is also the person who's going to frustrate it. Yeah? So frustration is a different set of experiences, and it's different because it is the first instantiation of an aggressive relationship, in our language, of hatred and destructiveness. And Klein says that, now remember, babies don't know the first thing about anything, okay? So when they're full of goodness, they're full of goodness, and the world is marvelous and beautiful. And when they feel full of badness and they scream in their fantasy, Klein says, they imagine that they've shattered the whole world with their scream. She wants us to get into that way of thinking. So the first relationship in relation to aggression is very frightening and horrible. Yeah? And if you and I were to look at these two states, we'd say, oh my God, that child, the baby, has got itself into quite a mess. One moment, it had something beautiful and exquisite. And the next moment, its hatred destroyed it. And now it is in utter despair. So that's the way Klein thinks about this first, the starting block now of living. Now, the depressive position, which is this paper that you read for today, is around that whole set of thinking about the depressive position, where Klein looks at not babies, at young children who, say, in play, destroy something and then feel terribly guilty. They feel full of remorse, or first they are full of a feeling of despair of what have I done. Yeah. So Klein thinks that there you see a derivative in plays, say with 2.5, 3, 4-year-olds, the kids she worked with, you see a derivative of something that belongs in early infancy and couldn't be articulated, communicated to us. And that then Klein makes an important point in that she thinks that this is then a natural process. It's a natural way in which we move through our living hatred and destructiveness. Can't avoid it because you can't have a feed without it coming to an end, basically, is what you see. Can't avoid it. And you can't but have this death instinct stuff stirred up in you then in relation to your object. In the beginning, it is too terrible to face. So you imagine this is a different object that's done that to you. Yeah? But when you begin to feel remorse, that is the beginning of recognizing that perhaps it is your destructiveness that has transformed that object into the terrible state in which it is now perceived to be. And Klein thinks that that's massively, massively important to make that psychic link. Because if you can feel that, sense of remorse, if you can look at your object and see what a terrible state it's in, that looking itself will connect it with your destructive impulses, and it will stir up an impulse under the sway of the life instinct to make it better. And that's essentially what the act of reparation is. It's an impulse in response to feeling some primitive kind of responsibility that allows you to repair your object. And Klein says, if you can go there, then you've got the foundations for true love, not idealized love, but true love. Yeah? So Klein thinks to love, you can't really love without experiencing hatred. And if your hatred is so fearful to you that you can't look it in the eye, so to speak, if it's so awful, then you'll never get through this reparative thing. So you'll keep falling out of love with this object that's now damaged and seek a new ideal object. Yeah? And she says that's no way to carry on, that you repeat your infantile fixation. But if you can bear to face that perhaps you have destroyed something in your object, that's the way forward. Then the reparative processes will begin. And I mean, you all know it from your experiences as grown-ups. You know, if you remember when you first fall in love with somebody and they're so marvelous and everything is, you know, you're just on cloud nine, aren't you? And then comes some recognition that some aspect of this person is not quite the way you imagined it was. And Klein would say, and what happens in your heart as you destroy them, you say, this bloody person is no good. And then you've got to have quite a dialogue with yourself and say, well, you know, it's only that his socks smell, but the other things that I saw in this person are still there. What am I condemning the, you know, gone from white to black like this? What am I doing that for? And that kind of not conscious, unconscious stuff, you know, that goes on in you is what allows the ideal object to transform into the real. And the process, Klein would say, is one of repairing the damage. Now, remember, this is unconscious fantasy. You don't think to yourself, oh my God, I've damaged the object. But you find yourself revisiting, thinking again, is it just in my head? You know, is that really so? And that's the kind of work that is typical of reparation. And if it goes right, you know, you probably say, I've had it with this person, I'm moving on to somebody else, and then you feel a bit awful. You know, in other words, affect gets involved with it, and that allows you to revise and think and so on. Okay. Now, in this paper, sorry, let me just see. I've nearly used up all my time. In this paper, Klein gives, I think, more instances of relationships, you know, in one's external relationships, shall we say. She talks about the one's relationship as a sexual partner, say. You remember that? Where she talks about basically Freud's notion that we have loving and hating feelings towards both parents, that we move them around from one to the other, and we take a particular position. And then when the time comes to having to choose a sexual partner, she says you get another opportunity to revisit the early compromises that you make. So all through the paper, she'll talk about, you know, how if I hope you like that. I really like the way she talks, for instance, about the infantile fantasies. Do you remember? She says the child has a notion that the father's penis puts babies inside the mother. Remember, we talk unconscious fantasy here, so don't take it too literally. But she says it's got that sort of picture. That's the primitive picture. And why does it have that primitive picture? Because Klein thinks at that moment that the baby, the child, is suffused with hatred towards the mother. So the mother becomes an uncreative figure, and the father is idealized as the person, you know, he's got all of creativity and he's going to give babies can put babies inside the mother, and the baby then, the child longs for the father to put babies inside of it. And of course, that redoubles the deprivation, the fact that it doesn't happen, and that the father closes the door every night and does business with the mother in fantasy to Klein, putting new babies inside the mother, increases the hatred, which in the same way Freud theorized it, thought, well, the hatred goes to one parent. So the mother is hated and the father is the font of these babies. And then she describes, I thought, in quite a lovely way, how when you can yourself, you're grown up and you can have babies yourself, thinking of women, that it becomes possible to revisit those compromises. And she talks about that if you can tolerate the damage done to the mother and to the mother's sexuality, if you can tolerate that guilt, then it becomes possible for you in your mind symbolically to repair it through a good sexual relationship that you have with your partner. According to Klein, it allows the father's penis to be a healthy, restorative organ, and the mother's genitals to be receptive to that. So that sort of captures something of the way she's thinking, that in adult life, we get new opportunities to restage the earlier unresolved solution to the love-hate thing, and to bring a different kind of resolution about. I think, Hannah, I had better stop there.
Okay, thank you so much. And now we're open for questions. There were a few in the chat, and you can either use the raise hand function. We're too big a group for you to actually just raise your hand. So either in the chat or using that function. But there was a question in the chat I'll just start with, which is, Fakhry, can you expand on what Klein is doing when she's using this word primitive kind of responsibility when referring to the act of reparation?
She means infancy. I know primitive is a complicated word, and Freud used it in different ways. You'll remember whose writing is it again? It's a very good book by an American analyst that it just escapes me now, that looks at that. But Klein is very simple. She means the earliest infantile stuff, and it's primitive in that she wants us to think it is unmitigated by social and grown-up considerations. It is raw. That's the meaning. Does that help? Does that clarify, or somebody wants to take it up?
I had a question, but I understand that the primitive part makes sense, but what about the kind of responsibility? You said where does the responsibility part come in? Where does the responsibility come in at infancy? Like, what's the roots of that?
Yes, these are such a good question, Tripta. It's not a good, these are not good words for it, but remember, we are constrained because how do you describe what's going on? But what she means is there is some kind of sense of wanting to make it better. Yeah? That's all she means. There is some sort of sense of wanting to make it better. Now, we might ask, why do we say that resides in the infant? And Klein would say, because the wish to make it better comes from the infant. You can see it. And therefore, we infer that it must be an impulse inside the infant's mind. God knows what it would look like if we could pull it out and examine it, but that's essentially what she means.
That's helpful, thanks.
And then Thomas, if you want to.
Yeah, I was just wondering, you mentioned at one point that the reason that Klein talks about the breast is because the infant doesn't know what a mother is or anything like that. And then close to the end of when you were talking, you talked about how Klein talks really graphically about like the genitals and like the penis and stuff. And I was wondering, like, so do you think that that's sort of a way, or like there's a possibility there to like think about infancy in like non-heteronormative relationships? Because like you can think about the penis and these different genital things as not necessarily being attached to like a father or a mother in a traditional sense. Like, do you think that that's like a good read on it, or do you think that maybe that's like inferring too much from what she wrote?
No, I think if you're thinking like that, I think Klein would love you. She would think you're getting the point that she's trying to make, that we may use notions that to our, if we say the father, and what we know what we mean, and she would want to say, I don't mean that. And if we were to say to her, well, why on earth did you say that then? And then she'd say, that's because there are these two figures, I think, that do exist in the child's world, and therefore in some way must be represented in the child's mind. And what I mean by the penis is something or other that is modeled on what the baby knows something about. That is a relation to the nipple and the breast, but doesn't exist on the mother's body. And therefore, it's the concreteness of infancy is what she's on about. So there's no such thing as it doesn't exist here, and who knows where it is. If it doesn't exist there, it must exist there. And that's well accepted by everybody, the concreteness of infant functioning. So when you decode it in the way that you do, I think she'd say, you've got the point, and that is the way. Does that clarify it a bit?
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much.
And Wendy.
Yeah, thank you so much, Fakhry, for joining us again. My question is regards a passage on the bottom of 311, and I guess since this seminar is called "The Possibilities of Repair," it's sort of about a question about the condition of possibility for a reparative instinct, also then becoming perhaps a limit to how far the reparative instinct can go, and it has to do with identification being a precondition for the desire to or the willingness to sacrifice and the desire to repair. And I guess it seems in that passage when she begins the section identification and making reparation that she's sort of no longer necessarily only talking about the infant or the primitive relation, and speaking more broadly to ourselves, the adult's ability to recognize someone or something as worthy of and in need of some kind of I don't know, benevolent or some action of generosity and sacrifice. And I guess I'm curious about how to think about that, not just psychologically, but kind of psychosocially, in terms of like, because it also seems that, I'm not sure if this was said explicitly in the text, but I also got the sense that the giving party or the reparative party needs to also feel somewhat secure in having enough of what they are prepared to give to the other in need, that it doesn't actually that it's not a sacrifice that actually is like I don't know, like deleterious or something like that. And so I'm curious about like these like conditions for the possibility of repair also maybe then becoming a kind of like limit to the broader application or possibilities of repair beyond identification or beyond coming only from the subject who recognizes herself as being capable of that kind of dearth, but also secure enough in it to give it. So I don't know, something like that.
Yes, it's such an important set of issues you're raising there. I think what Klein means here by identification is something very specific. You notice in that passage you quoted, she says it's a condition, that sort of identification, for real and strong feelings of love. What she means by that is not idealized love. She means by that the kind of love that includes an awareness of one's aggression towards the object. Yeah? In other words, it presupposes that the moment when you project your aggression into the object and create a horrific figure, that you've moved on from that there's been some kind of reparation. Yeah? And that involves, part of reparation involves taking back projection. So instead of saying, this object is terrible, you begin to say, maybe I've put the terribleness into this object. Yeah? That's part of the process. So once you begin that line, then internally you repair the object so that they look a little bit more like they really are. And here she's talking about identifying with that kind of object. Do you see? So there's a process implied here. Now, when you talk racism, you're talking something else. You're talking that your object is full of your projections, so that this process has not yet taken place. Yeah? And Klein would say the work in addressing racism, or I would say that's what my book is about, consists in trying to find where in your unconscious fantasy you have damaged your object. Yeah? So that a person who happens to have dark skin, say, if it's black-white racism, comes to have unconsciously various other things that are imposed on them and restrict their capacity to be ordinary 3D sort of figures. Yeah? So you're talking, I think, there of a different kind of object. You could say it's an unreconstructed object. The object still contains projective identification. Yeah? And there's work to be done. And so if you've got that kind of object, that will not give you true love that Klein's talking about in that passage. Does that help, Wendy?
Yeah, very much. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Great.
Thank you. And Richard, I know you also have a question in the chat. If it's the same question, do you mind voicing it? And if not, you can maybe offer both and we can. Richard, if you want to go ahead. Can you hear me?
Richard needs to
One
unmute.
second. Okay.
Sorry, Hannah, I just lost that. Kia ora, Fakhry, and thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
I was just wondering, in regards to Klein's, you mentioned just like, Klein seeing herself having this fidelity to Freud, and then many of her sort of theoretical and practical innovations coming from her work with children. But I was just wondering, sort of intertextually here, this emphasis that she places on this dualism of love and hate. Do you know what the main sources in Freud's work that she's drawing on here are? I mean, Beyond the Pleasure Principle came to mind for me, but I was wondering, if you knew more about that sort of textual background.
Well, life is easy, isn't it? I mean, the life instinct, presumably, we don't have a problem with, where one would say that if you happen to come out of your infancy and you're a living human being, life forces must have triumphed over death forces. So that's sort of axiomatic in the Freudian thing. But if you go back to Freud's argument about the death instinct, which is controversial, Not all analysts accepted it, that even in Freud's time, and not all do today. But Klein certainly counts herself as one of those who does accept it. Now, that is based on the notion of the nirvana principle, where Freud says that as biological organisms, we come into this world with something that is determined to make us survive and thrive. That's the life instinct. And then he's got his theory about how that works. And built into our being as biological entities is something that works systematically from the day we are born to the end, where we are going to return into inorganic matter. And that is Freud's argument for why he thinks that that reality, basic reality of life, must also be represented in the psyche. Yeah. So Klein totally accepts that argument. It's a metapsychological or philosophical position, because you don't have to accept that. That's why a lot of people don't. But Freud does, because he says, if you accept those two, plus one other observation, namely that the human infant cannot survive without somebody else taking care of it. That is its basic dependency. Freud says if you take those three things into account, you can build a theory of mind. And, that's beautiful, as if you're interested in theory, how you make theory without making excessive assumptions. And I think Klein was very influenced by that, and she thought the argument is compelling to her. And then her work maps out how from the earliest stages in development, that operates. So for example, for Klein, the source of anxiety is not, for instance, anxious things that we are exposed to in the beginning. She says the source of anxiety is this thing inside that wants to kill us, that coexists. So you see an interesting way of mapping from the earliest phase. And remember, in the beginning, we can't really get evidence. You can garner evidence, put them together and say that's, and other people will put them together in a different way. But that's, as I understand it, that's where it comes from.
Great, thank you very much.
And before we get to Seth and Aziz, there are a couple comments in the chat that just invite you to speak to the question of basically a little bit cause and effect, or where the feeling of guilt comes from. So Jeffrey put it, is the infantile divide of the good-bad object that produces guilt and the need for reparation. Does that suggest that the infant has a moral code? Why does Klein assume that the infantile experience of plenitude and deprivation produces this kind of guilt? And Carlin asks a version of this. Does she think that the impulse to make it better is motivated by something specific, whether a survival or something else?
Yeah, that's such an important point. I don't think Klein makes any of those connections. And you could criticize Klein that she doesn't. Because she says, if we call it reparation, that doesn't mean that the infant thinks of it as reparation. So she wants us to see it as something that's a sort of process that naturally evolves, so that there is a perception of something that's damaged and an impulse to do something about it, not out of a sense of feeling guilty. It's called guilt sometimes because it is what in adult life or later life we would say, I must be feeling guilty. I want to make it a bit better. But she's not assuming that babies feel that. Moreover, she would then say, and we might wonder whether this phenomenon that is observable might be the foundation of what might become guilt and a moral code later, when it is formalized. But I do share the problem with cause-effect. It's a difficult one. I don't think Klein would want to go there. Or maybe Klein did. You must remember that when these analysts were writing, Freud and his early followers, it's very much under the sway of a positivist model of science, where sort of the billiard ball notion of causation was the way people thought. Whereas today we wouldn't think of life like that. We tend to think that things are a bit more dialectical. One thing instantiates something else and it influences it, and then it goes back to what the other thing. And, so we're searching for a framework that better can encapsulate these things. But I don't take the billiard ball version so seriously. So in other words, if you say, okay, well, Klein's saying something begins to shift that wasn't there before, and if you follow her play stuff, it's really interesting because she'll show how she'll show when the impulse to repair doesn't occur. And she'll show that that's connected with having very split object relationships. In other words, you're in a more paranoid mindset. Things are either already by definition fine, or they are completely catastrophic and disastrous, and it's got nothing to do with you. That's a paranoid, schizoid mindset. And she will show how, in the course of analysis, that begins to shift to this other state where wanting to make things better, wanting to repair, wanting to build, seems to come into focus. If you look at it like that, you can see that this is not a billiard ball type thing. It's much more a process that seems under certain conditions to just get going. And I think what's often underemphasized is that Klein means that for most people, that happens anyway. It's an organic process that happens. It's not that we have to be taught how to do it. And it's again to do with that with those two instincts and having good experience, these psychic developments seem to take place.
So maybe we can have the 3 hand-raised questions and return to the questions in the chat after breakout groups, because there are so many fantastic questions in the chat as well. So Seth, if you want to go, that'd be awesome.
Thanks, Hannah. And thank you, Fakhry. This is really so beautifully clarifying. Well, you kind of answered my question actually in the last response. It was really sort of about like temporality, like it's the temporality here is a very repetitive one. It's not billiard ball, but it's like playing thousands of games of pool, and there's a tremendous amount of redundancy in it, and then little things happen between games that start to introduce something new. So anyway, that's also kind of really clarified.
And that rings true to life, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you think, I think I've got a nearly 2-year-old grandson, that I see a lot, and I can observe all the time, and things are very, very repetitive, and it's just the way it is. So it isn't neat, and yeah.
I did have one question about the use of the word drive in the essay, and how it might relate to, she talks about instincts, but she often talks about the drive to to repair, or later in the essay the drive to explore, the drive to restore. One, just wondering how literally we should take that as a term. Is she talking about drives, or sometimes she calls it a wish, and how those might relate to fantasies. It strikes me that the drive here is being used as sort of like a quite mysterious and sort of motor impulse, and then the fantasy is obviously it's a building sort of impulse. I wonder if you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah. It's the very good point. You got to remember where in historical time this is, and you've got to remember Klein's loyalty to Freud. So I don't think she would ever not have spoken about the instincts. But if you read the way she writes, it's obviously not, she doesn't really mean instincts, she doesn't want to It's not that. And why you need drive is if you have a fantasy, you know, that gives content to something, but it doesn't have oomph. It doesn't have something, you know, that can drive you to want to do things. So I read it simply. I don't know if you do, Seth. I read it simply as trying to give some expression to that, you know, that they're not just sort of random fantasies and so on that exist, but they become compelling to you. You know, they are animated. I suppose is probably the best way we could call it. It's animated. In other words, it's something to do with us being animals, you know, being full of, you know, stuff that we want to get on with because our being is felt to be dependent on it. So that's how I understand drive. Sometimes she talks about it as love. And, you know, as long as you're thinking that love is not some academic thing that that doesn't drive, if you think that love will drive you to do all sorts of things, that's Klein would agree with you. And if you think that aggression, you know, also hate will drive you to want to do things, then Klein would agree with that too. But she does use it interchangeably, you're right. And she's not wedded to instinct at all. That's the way I understand it.
So Aziz, if you
Thanks.
want to ask the last question of this part, afterwards, I'll sort of walk us through what will happen next. And then there's so many great questions in the chat and Jackie's question that we'll return to on the other side. But Aziz, please.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Dr. Davids. I think you clarified some of this stuff with the comment on like a paranoid schizoid mindset getting in the way of reparation. I'm curious about the example of colonialism and the explorer and how the genocide of the natives generates a guilt that gets channeled in a reparative fashion to actually repopulate the colonizer. So it sounded to me like and I could be misunderstanding this, please clarify if I am, but it sounded like the reparative impulse does not necessarily have to be directed towards the damaged object, but can in fact, you know, perpetuate the damage in some fashion. Am I misunderstanding something here?
I mean, you're opening up a complicated topic, and that's part of what you're doing in this section of your seminars, isn't it? To think through the connection between the clinically derived theory and social phenomena, historical phenomena such as colonialism. So you are a bit anticipating it, but I think it. If it comes to something like colonialism or slavery or these things, I think one has to ask the question as to whether the guilt associated with that really can be faced, because we're not now talking about infantile situations. We are talking about societies and grown-ups and so on who have all manner of sophisticated cognitive and feeling processes that they have access to. So I think it's the wrong question to link it with infancy. Of course, the antecedents is in infancy and so on. So I think the parallel is much more that if I steal from somebody, let's say, how would I make reparation for that? You know, and we would say, firstly, you've got to acknowledge that you've stolen from somebody. Secondly, you've got to feel a bit bad. You've got to feel the guilt. You can't, if you're justifying yourself all the time, then you're nowhere near feeling the guilt. And if you say, like the Nazi guards did, I was only following orders, you know, you're nowhere near facing the guilt. So, you know, there are signposts, I think, that one can use. And I think the general principle that one has to acknowledge that damage has been done, that's number one. Secondly, you've got to be able to identify your own role in that damage. Thirdly, you've got to feel guilt. That is, you've got to feel bad about it. And if those things are in place, then Klein, I think, would say, and I certainly would say, then creative ways of making it better will come to you. If you haven't followed those steps, then you are probably wanting to do manic repair. You want to do something that'll make you feel better. And that's not how it works with reparation. First, you got to feel the pain of what you have done to your objects. And then, if you can bear that, then you will have grief at how, as a human being, you could stoop so low. And then, if one can bear to go to that pain, then the life forces, as Klein talks about it, will help you to fashion some kind of genuine repair, whatever that is. I don't know if I'm a bit anticipating what's going to be the work that you'll do, but that's the way I see it. Aziz, does that sort of help a bit?
It does, thank you.
Thank you. And yes, there's more in the chat that's anticipating, that this will be the terrain of many of our weeks. So what we'll do now, and this will be again the format the seminar will follow, is we'll take a 5-minute break. If you are staying for breakout rooms, please stay on. I will start to sort you. And if you are leaving for the day and you want to rejoin, you can rejoin about 30 minutes to the end of our time or so. And we'll go into a kind of short introductory breakout group, maybe for about 30 minutes or so. So we'll take a 5-minute break. If you want to be put in a breakout group, please stay on. And if not, you can log off now. And just all please join me in thanking Fakhry for a really phenomenal presentation, as always.
Thank you
so much. Hannah, do I join you again at 7?
And I suppose that maybe if we take a more Kleinian point of view, we have a much more complicated relationship to the other because we're interacting with an other sort of from the beginning. And so that narcissism that we may encounter, at least in the kind of dim sense of narcissism, is some kind of refusal of otherness or refusal of alterity. If that is arising as a manic defense, it looks somewhat different. And so that was kind of the dynamic that I wanted to ask about.
And sorry, I missed the beginning of that, Jackie. You contrasted Klein's sort of picture of the infant as from the beginning involved in a very complicated way with objects, with others.
Yeah.
You contrasted that with Freud, did you? In what way?
I wanted to contrast that with primary narcissism.
Primary.
Yeah, that seemed like a major kind of bedrock difference, even if you end up talking about the same phenomenon, because with an adult, they're not engaged in that.
Absolutely. I think it's a bit, I mean, if you were to talk, if you were to talk to Klein, she certainly made it a bedrock difference. According to her, the infant is object related from birth, as opposed to the Freudian picture of the infant in a narcissistic bubble from birth. I think people put too much on that, because you could, and I say that mainly because I like Freud so much, I can't see that the two things are incompatible, because, if you Winnicott, in one of his papers, I forget which one it is, he's got a very nice little drawing he makes of the first theoretical feed, where he's trying to make the point about how essential it is for the mother to be attuned to the baby and not to impinge on the baby. He's making that point, but it's got a very nice picture. But it just struck me that if you thought that, you may live in a narcissistic bubble, But once the first theoretical feed has happened, then you are no longer in that bubble. Then you are in a world of object relations. And I don't think Freud would necessarily disagree with one, or even if he did, his model is not contradictory to that. So I think it's a small difference, for all intents and purposes, by the end of the first day, your baby is certainly no longer in a bubble. It's arrived in the world, and the world is one in which there are others and they impinge on you or don't or whatever. And, you're busy constructing this internal world. So I myself think Klein went a bit overboard by, making that such a big point of difference. But, in a way, it doesn't matter. We're not in Bible studies, so we can live with that. Now, I don't know if that makes a difference. But the points you make about, if you think that fundamentally we are about what we do to our objects, call it that for want of a better term, and if you've got a framework that builds this in from the beginning, it's better. Now, I totally agree with that. And somebody asked earlier about, how can you make an infant responsible? Yeah, somebody did ask about how can you hold an infant responsible for damage to an object? It's such a great question, that. But if you forget trying to answer that question, given that you can't get into the head of a baby and figure it out, you're just gonna have to accept we make models, and hopefully they approximate or at least don't contradict what we can observe. But if you get out of trying to sort it out that way, one of the great things clinically, that the great advantage of making an assumption that you are responsible for whatever you do, whatever damage happens, it's such a great one for me clinically, that, and patients struggle with that notion, the most common thing, defense against it, and we all understand it as he or she made me do that. He or she provoked me. I found myself in this situation where what could I do? And as a clinician, I always think, all right, that's fair enough. That's a certain description. But if your hand ended up punching somebody in response to that, unfortunately, in your internal world, you have a sense of agency for that, and you are held responsible for it. So, that comes from the Klein orientation, that, it happened on your watch, it happened in your body, and therefore you can't use the reality that somebody provoked you to absolve yourself of any responsibility. So that's how I come at it, from a clinical point of view. And I think then, one is left with a question of what are you responsible for and what do you think you're responsible for? And how do these two things stack up?
Thank you. And I'll just remind people that you're more than welcome to use the chat, and it can also be reporting from breakout groups or things that came up there, as well as this kind of question and answer model. A larger group discussion is also fine. Richard, please.
So there was one sort of question / issue that got raised in our group at the end, but we didn't really have time to speak to, that I just wanted to ask about. So I admit to being fairly naive when it comes to Klein and object relations here. But so she briefly mentions homosexuality in the text, and she sort of seems to talk about it in a way where it figures into a kind of sublimation or a displacement of these kind of reparative processes that are going on in relation to the love object and within the kind of like family constellation. I sort of have, when I say I have a kind of naive understanding of object relations, the way that I've tended to view it is that it has this kind of maybe a kind of emphasis on a fairly normative notion of sexuality and the sexual relation and within the kind of nuclear family context.
Yeah.
I was wondering, can you say something a little bit here about her treatment of homosexuality as almost a kind of, because it seems to me that she was sort of framing it as a kind of what would you call it, almost some sort of compromise or
Yeah.
sort of temporary sort of sublimated attempt to enact some of these reparative processes that's, you know, part only a, what would you call it, a stage on a process of sexual maturation towards a kind of normalized heterosexual coupling.
Mm. Well, that's a very good point. All of this literature is written at a time when heteronormative assumptions were made about the human condition. I think today we would be less inclined to do that, you know, so when I read it, I don't take her that literally. I think, even, and I mean that, what I mean by that is even if Klein herself thought that, I think her discourse does not necessarily think that, if you see what I mean. So I'm looking to see whether one could sort of look at it more the way we would today, where we wouldn't want to be so homophobic in our ways of looking at the human condition. And certainly in the way clinicians, and I think all clinicians that I know talk about it, there's much, much more variation in the way one thinks, where one could say, today one would say, it is not that the object choices that she speaks of there and that the compromises that she thinks are more incomplete, they don't permit complete reparation. It's not as if it's confined only to a homosexual object choice. You could find a heterosexual object choice that has exactly the same features from a psychic point of view, you know, and so we do that to all the way we look today, you know, because it's you know, it's frankly prejudicial, and it creates a caricature out of one condition, which is not right. You get the same variation among homosexual people as heterosexual people, you know. Now, it doesn't mean that there are not interesting questions to ask, but you can't do that. You can't do science in a prejudiced environment. You know, you've got to do it in a tolerant, respectful of difference environment. And that's, we're in the middle of that struggle as a profession, you know.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, it strikes me as interesting in a sense. I mean, I know this is contentious, and I'll sort of complete my thought here, but it just like in Freud himself, it's interesting how Freud there's such a strong emphasis on the kind of the inherent you know, sort of polymorphic perversity of sexuality, and the way that I think in Freud, there is a tension in him, of course, between this a kind of normative, a heteronormativity, but at the same time, he really seems to foreground this kind of polymorphic perversity. But I sometimes get the impression from what I've read of object relations that there's a tendency a bit more towards this kind of maturation towards a heteronormative sexuality than you even find in Freud, which is just
absolutely, and it's a problem. You know, there's a lot of work to be done to get that kind of prejudice out of our discourse. You know, it's not, as you say, it's not in Freud's discourse, but it is some here and there, it slips out.
It is, yeah.
The prejudice slips out. And yet at other times, Freud's extraordinarily enlightened, you know, even writing particularly about homosexuality, you know, and that you wouldn't want the discipline of psychoanalysis to be on the side of imposing norms on anyone. I mean, incredible. But there's hard work to be done to, you know, to rescue the discourse, to bring it, because, you know, as time moves on, you get different angles on things. And today I think we're a bit more alert to how, you know, to put it very bluntly, how our own object choice may seem to us natural and normative. You know, so if you're heterosexual, that it just creeps in. And we don't think that's right. So you've got to get that out and go to what is revolutionary, really. Revolutionary in the sense of calling into question the compromises that society imposes on us. Yeah, that to find the revolutionary in psychoanalytic theory, it's a big ask, and you know. But thank you for raising it, Richard.
And
so
I saw that. Sorry, go ahead, Fakhry.
So just going to say, so Kleinian psychoanalysis has the same challenge to identify those assumptions. I have to say, if I were to talk about among colleagues looking at clinical material, you tend to find a much more enlightened view. You know, when one's just talking, you know, an analyst talking about somebody that they're involved with, that they care about, and whom they're struggling with. I think you get to the nuts and bolts of it rather than this normative imposition. But the discourse, of course, is also important.
Fakhry, there are a couple questions in the chat that return more to the status of unconscious fantasy, and then one about the sort of the social, what's on the outside, not what's on the inside. So the first question is to hear a little bit more about the status of unconscious fantasy and whether reparation for Klein is something that only occurs in the internal world. And then a follow-up, could you say more about the difference between one kind of repair, like true reparation, and manic repair? And then on the other side, folks would also like to hear, and maybe we can just end with the inside and the outside picture. Did Klein, or do Kleinians have a way to think about the impact, the power and force of the external world on individuals? Was she thinking about the impact of actual violence rather than the internal picture of the infant? Or was she ignoring larger cultural violence in the wider environment?
So you'll have to remind me the different...
First, a little bit more on does reparation sort of, what's the status of unconscious fantasy? Does reparation only occur internally?
No. Remember, unconscious fantasy, you can't see. You have to infer it. So you infer it from the kinds of things people are preoccupied with and the kinds of things people are avoiding. So that's how you gain access to that. And that's always connected with the external world. You know, I don't care about climate change. You know, would be one example. And then we would say, well, why on earth do you not care about climate change? Because in reality, we think this is a major existential threat to us and our children and everybody else. How on earth can you get into a state where you don't care about that? And that begins to open up what's going on in your head. And one notion, fairly low-level theorizing, is you must have a very idealized picture of the earth. that you can dump all kinds of stuff into it, and that this is without any consequence. And you can see where Kleinians would then take that. You'd think, now that reveals a certain kind of object relationship. That is, that you are dependent on an object, but you don't have to take responsibility for what you do to it. You know, how much you take from it and how much, to put it crudely, how much excrement you dump into it. Yeah. And one would want to open that up. Not, so you can see what I'm talking about. It's an idealized picture of the breast, Klein would say, that you have, where you haven't yet realized that how you treat the breast has consequences. Yeah? So that the reparation process has been short-circuited. That's how Klein would think about it. But the point is, it's not about the breast, it's about the earth. So if one wanted to engage with it, you would engage with it where it is being staged. You see, it's like a child who's playing with dolls. You don't talk to the child about the breast. That's a background concept in your mind. You explore what's happened, you know, and then the belief is that if one unpacks it a little bit, you will get into this area of whether how you treat your object that you're dependent on makes a difference, whether it matters. So the external world is always important, yeah, but your internal frame of reference guides what you think are the key issues. Because if now for me, what would matter is I would not want people to have insight into this. I would want them to change their bloody behavior. Yeah. So if you're a Kleinian, you'd say, okay, what does that person have to do? You know, and you'd say, okay, they've got to face that their actions have done something. And you can see ways of opening it up, you know, that do you sort of follow? And that would guide the interchange if you wanted it to be therapeutic. And you'd expect to find the projection of guilt, isn't it? If you don't want to feel guilt, the best way to deal with it is to project it into somebody else. So, you know, you tend to get splitting where these people who are saying that have an agenda, apparently. And you'd realize then if you have a Kleinian orientation, you've got to do battle just there. And the defenses you will get are the defenses associated with using intellectual defenses. Yeah. So you have to go into how people get, excited by it. That is, you turn it into an erotized interchange, all the while avoiding the topic, you know, as if you're in this sort of area, you don't have to consider what the real crisis is, what the emergency is. So it sort of helps you, it seems to me, with trying to guide the process of engagement of these things, but where they are. And I mean, I know more about these things when it comes to racism, you know, how to find the guilt that people don't feel, you know, and how, if you have access to my book, there's a chapter on dealing with the question of guilt in the aftermath of the fall of apartheid. I'm from South Africa originally, so I describe the process in a group, you know, and where this orientation helped me to identify what you had to put your finger on, where the guilt was. And then once one got it out, it turned into a persecutory situation. And again, having a Kleinian orientation that you can have persecutory defenses, paranoid defenses against feeling guilt, allowed one to intervene in the life of a group. So you can see how the model that guilt had to be found first. And then one had to create a setting in which it could be felt and in which aggression associated, hatred towards somebody who makes you feel guilty, where that could be felt and how that then moved things on. So I do think that the model, as long as, you know, models are models, they should stay in the background. They're not in the foreground, but they can guide one in dealing with real world issues, you know, because you can recognize when one is moving towards what needs to be faced. You can recognize the kind of defenses that take you further away from it, and so on. So that's, so absolutely, it's in the world. It's not, you know, in an intellectual matter. What was the other thing, Hannah? I've now forgotten.
The last thing is just about this question of the difference between repair, like true reparation, and manic.
True repair always involves pain. You cannot look, you know, if you look at a damaged object, in other words, if you look at damage, if you don't feel the pain, there's no way you can do repair. And sometimes people look, but they're not looking. You know, they're looking, but, you know, not taking it in. You got to look. You got to see how terrible somebody else's situation is. And if you could do some of that and suffer, then you have the chance of doing repair. Then, as I've put it, the natural process of trying to effect repair takes place. And that has real effects on the world. You know, people want to do something that makes it better. You know, you want to go, if it's in a relationship, you feel that you really must try and make it better, you know, say sorry, bring flowers, do this, but in a proper way. Yeah? Now that way, you also learn how not to damage your objects. Yeah? You learn about your capacity to damage, and that's humbling. It makes you a bit more in tune with you and what you're capable of. That's real thing. The manic repair is when you begin to feel a little bit bad and you do something to undo the whole situation so you don't have to feel the pain. That's the criterion, you know, so that she mentions it somewhere in relation to love relationships, doesn't she? No, in mothers and children, where you become, you know, the embodiment of, you know, the ideal this and self-sacrificing this, that, and the other. Those are symptoms, she says, of manic repair. So if you bear in mind that there are these two things, that's helpful.
Thank you so much. So unfortunately for us, and probably fortunately for you, we have to end it there. And thank you so much for coming back to speak with us. In 2 weeks' time, we'll keep going with sort of Kleinian thought in Sedgwick and Munoz, and Grace Lavery will be speaking. And so looking forward to seeing everyone in 2 weeks' time. Fakhry, thank you so, so much.
Thank you all very much for your interest and for your lovely contributions. Lovely Sunday early evening for me. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye, thank you.
Bye-bye.